This is the range of hackberry and green. There's a couple of satellite populations a little bit north of the study area, and swamp white oak, which is south of our study area. And so when we look at all the options we have in these sites, we were really concerned we did not have a lot of species that were truly kind of wetland adapted species, so getting those out there. And then one exotic, Manchurian ash, which was not our decision, but actually folks working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Forest Service wanted a species that they could at least get basket making material from if black ash was removed from the site, and it's shown that had the potential for that. So a true assisted migration from the exotic population. So again, just to remind folks, these are not, you're just not going to clear cut and plant and you have a new forest there. These are very challenging places to work in, and so at adapting, thinking about the species that might work on those sites. And the reason I show these pictures is for context for the first result of what I'll show, and that regardless of what we planted out there, if you look at the scale of this y-axis, is just survival of non-ash species after 3 years. Those of you that are regeneration specialists out there, I know I would be fired with this low survival rate, less than 50% survival. Thankfully I work for universities, so my job is safe. I can kill a lot of seedlings. But a couple of things to take home, besides the low survival rates of the species we planted out there, you notice the lowest survival regardless of when we planted fall or spring is in the clear cuts, right? These are the sites that you lost that black ash transpiration, the water table bounced, and it was really hard for these trees to grow well, whereas as we increased the canopy cover, we saw higher survival. Not great, but higher survival. If we look at the species and what's surviving out there, the highest survival rates we've seen have been swamp white oak, and this has continued even into the fourth year of survival, not just 3 years of survival. American elm, Manchurian ash, and hackberries would kind of be our top 4. And if you're following along, basically we have 2 out-of-range species, hackberry and white oak, an exotic species, Manchurian ash, and then a species that's totally limited by Dutch elm disease are our top 4 species. So kind of a menagerie of non-native or non-adaptive species at the site. And the point being is if we hadn't included some of these strange species out there, we might have missed out on what actually look like pretty viable options right now for maintaining tree cover on the site. At the same token, some of the currently present on-site species did not do very well, in terms of adaptation out there. Looking at that by treatment, so this 4-panel graph, I have the harvesting treatment, so clear cut, control, girdle, and group selection. This is 3-year survival. So swamp white oak, American elm, Manchurian ash, hackberry, balsam poplar, red maple, all the way down to birch, yellow birch. And we see in general, again, clear cut, pretty low survival overall, but we actually have very high survival rates, which is the x-axis, in places where we actually still have that canopy present, whether it's the control, the group selection, the girdle. Really saying that if we're emulating the historic recruitment regime in the system, we might actually have some options to get these species on the site. So people often say, well, how are you going to replace ash? Well, we're not. These forests are still ash forests. They're not looking at my map and saying, oh, I should disappear because emerald ash grows in the landscape. And so we're not replacing ash. We're actually probably increasing ash by cutting it. This is just natural regeneration on that site. And so black ash is still going to be an important part of this forest, at least before we keep kind of knocking it back and making more of a shrubby form. That presents an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is that when we know black ash can grow on these sites, and hopefully it'll kind of keep the water tables down as we're trying to get other species established. But the challenge is also it's going to be a pretty fierce competitor in places, and so we're now looking at ways to kind of release these seedlings from black ash competition in different places. So just to close, I really think adaptation just is part of the toolbox, but even though it's a new objective, these are still the same forests we've been working in before adaptation and assisted migration was on the scene. And so work within those systems. What are the natural dynamics of those forests? How can we build on our understanding of those natural dynamics to figure out what it makes sense to introduce species on those sites? And what we're seeing is that if we just took the attitude of, well, ash is doomed, get rid of it and plant something else, well, we actually made our lives harder by doing that because you bounce the water table, you increase the number of competitors out there. And so building on what we understand from the natural dynamics, like that gaps or how things are recruited historically in these forests, maybe we should use silvicultural systems that emulate that dynamic as opposed to some new approaches just focused solely on climate and EAP. And I didn't show growth data, but we've also been looking at growth, and balsam poplar of a kind of local species now on these sites tends to do a fairly good balance between growth and survival for species that are currently adapted, whereas swamp white oak continues to be the kind of champion of these sites in terms of its growth, a species we wouldn't have included if we hadn't factored in climate change. And so I think an important take home in terms of what we're trying out there. And so balsam poplar is not supposed to do well over the long term under climate change, but might be a kind of good near-term strategy, whereas swamp white oak is projected both to do well currently based on what we're seeing as well as over the long term. So I want to acknowledge a lot of folks that fed a lot more mosquitoes than I have. I'm out on these sites, particularly Mitch Slater has been the lead technician on this. And probably have time for like a quick question if folks have that.
One question.
Okay.
You guys thought about implementing maybe a dredging system to lower the water table, or are these sites predicted to get drier because they're on the east?
So right now, the projection is that maybe the distribution of precip's going to change, but we're still going to see very wet conditions out there. And there was some suggestion of like mounding and dredging. The challenge is just it's such an people aren't really willing to do such intensive practices on those sites. But there has been some work where they've done local mounding, and it seems to have increased the survival of too many. The biggest issue is that we have historically not managed much in these areas. There's veneer quality ash, and so to operationally do some of these things, the economics of that and the scale of that would be quite challenging. And so folks are looking for other simpler ways that we might be able to at least increase resilience over these areas. But no, it's a good, it might be more feasible, possibly in Canada, where you might have bigger scales of operations in these areas. Thanks,
on-the-ground example of assisted migration in the context of red pine forests in the Lake States. I'm just trying to get this thing. So what I'll talk about is transitioning red pine forest to a warmer, drier future, and I call it assisting the replacement of iconic forest type, because I think this type of forest in the northern Lake States is really what people think about as the North Woods. I'll acknowledge Tony is involved in this work, Linda Nagel at Colorado State, and Brad Massoud we're working with some of his data here, his thoughts, Jacob Mueller. And the idea here is kind of summarize, I'll talk about climate change really briefly and red pine forests in Minnesota, what the expectations are. I'll introduce a project that we're working on called Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change. It's a big U.S. national effort, but I'll focus on what we're doing with it here in this forest type. And then we'll talk about assisted migration as one part of that project. It's really about an attempt of the national forest we're working with to operationalize assisted migration. So a little bit on climate change over in Minnesota. Here's the predictions. This is high emission scenario by the end of the century. So a fairly substantial increase in average temperature, winter temperature, and summer temperature. Precipitation annually, maybe not a big change, but it's this growing season average summer temperature, or excuse me, precipitation decrease that's expected to be a concern in the northern part of the states. You can see that this is where our lab is in northern Minnesota, Grand Rapids, and the weather station there, and it's happening there. Tony showed this same slide. It's kind of a classic thing for Minnesota. Projections are summers like Kansas and winters like northern Illinois for Minnesota, with increasing summer droughts and soil moisture deficits. So what does that mean in terms of forest and vegetation? The expectations are concurrent shifts in tree habitat, generally shifting to the northeast. It was interesting to see Sally Aiken's talk in that paper she talked about with hardwoods migrating to the west. I got to look that up. That's new to me. But anyhow, right now, in my mind, it's shifting to the northeast with boreal species, subboreal moving out, and prairie elements and oak moving into this region of forest. And what I want to focus on is this region here, which is historically was largely dominated by red pine forest. So in northern Minnesota, we call this the northern dry mesic mixed woodland. Mixed because yes, it's red pine dominated, but there's this range of other species that are part of that forest naturally. And it's important, again, I mentioned this, it's that iconic regional forest type, not just for Minnesota, but Michigan and Wisconsin as well. Really high value forest products coming out of that forest type, probably higher than any other type of forest we have in Minnesota, particularly large boles and cabin logs. So it's important for a number of reasons. It's also projected to be future climate vulnerable. So again, with this reduced habitat suitability for a number of the component species. And this comes out of Lewis Iverson and Company's Tree Atlas modeling, which he's done for the eastern United States, and there's kind of downscaling and realize it's less accurate, but to the national forests in the eastern U.S. And you see this is current importance value, projected change in importance value under a high emission scenario, a reduction in potential habitat suitability for a range of those component species, including red pine here. Not a huge reduction, but somewhat of a reduction. So that's the concern. At the same time, his modeling projects increased habitat suitability for a few of the other component species that are already part of that red pine ecosystem. So bur oak, red maple, eastern white pine. So what this suggests to us, this iconic regional forest type is potentially on the cusp of major change in terms of composition and ultimately structure and function. So what we are asking, working with managers who are interested in, one, can they build resistance to that change? Can they foster resilience to that change within the natural range of variability for the system? Or should we be thinking about helping to transition those forests to something new and different? And that's where this project comes in, Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change. We call it ASK. You know, and in general, the goals are this: can we foster resistance, resilience, or can we enable adaptation to uncertain futures? And this is led, it's really a national effort led by Linda Nagel at Colorado State. You can see the various people involved in that here. And currently, the projection for this is to install the study I'll talk about here in just a second. The pointer just quit. At 5 locations across the U.S. And the ones that are up and going now, the one I'll talk about is Cutfoot Experimental Forest here, and then Tony is leading up an installation on the Dartmouth Second Grant Forest there. I think that this is non-functional. So again, resistance, resilience, transition, response. If you're familiar with the literature on forest and climate change adaptation, you know that that's coming out of Connie Millar and company's Ecological Applications paper from a few years ago, where she kind of laid out the framework for thinking about adaptation in the context of resistance, resilience. She called it response, we call it transition. So that's really what we're trying to do. And so I'll focus on this Cutfoot Experimental Forest project. It's on the Chippewa National Forest, which is in northern Minnesota. Tony showed that same forest we're working with on that other project. So they're really proactive in thinking about how to operationalize these things on the ground. Harvested a couple of winters ago and planted big treatment units. It's a big experiment. And it involves no action, a resistance treatment, a resilience, and a transition. And Linda and a bunch of those kind of paper in Journal of Forestry just recently that outline the whole kind of national effort. And I'm just going to show this briefly. The resistance treatment is essentially feeding red pine to reduce, Tony talked about this in his plenary talk, soil moisture stress on the residual trees. And there's really good evidence that that works in red pine, in Ponderosa pine, in Norway spruce, Scots pine, etc. So that's resistance. Resilience works within the natural range, thank you, of variation for the system in question. And so it's really kind of a variable density feeding approach that we're using here. And then planting native species, most of which, the first 4, are projected to be climate change adaptable in this system as part of that treatment. And it also includes jack pine, which isn't, under Lewis Iverson's tree atlas model, projected to have stable habitat suitability in the future. But it's certainly a species that's dry site adapted, so we include that as well. I point those other 2 treatments out just so you know the only thing that we're not only doing this next treatment, which is a bit more radical, and it's the one that involves assisted migration. So we call this the transition treatment. It essentially involves an irregular shelter wood, expanding gaps. And the idea here is not to, as Tony has pointed out in his plenary and just recently in the previous talk, we're not removing this forest type, this species, red pine, that's kind of projected to potentially decline into the future, but we're trying to transition it by maintaining that species on site in some form, opening up the system, providing an array of environmental conditions, and then working with potential species that may ultimately replace red pine in there. So The native species we're working with in that transition treatment include bur oak, red maple, eastern white pine, northern red oak. Again, projected to either kind of hold their own with northern red oak or increase in habitat suitability. And so it's a big planting effort. We're trying to capture natural regeneration in this as well, but there's a big artificial regeneration planting effort. And the AM part of this is that the seed source for those species come from the next southern climate zone in Minnesota, in some cases Wisconsin for those species. And then the other part of this, in terms of the novel species we're adding to into this treatment, are these three here: white oak, true white oak, Quercus alba, black cherry, and bitternut hickory. Again, these things are projected to have, with tree atlas, an increase in habitat suitability, or kind of holding its own. And again, the seed source for that planting effort are from the next southern seed zone in Minnesota or Wisconsin. And with these species here, there's established populations not too terribly far from our study area that are within 150, 120, 150 kilometers. There's also outlier populations that are already within the local region there. So they are there. And I guess I would suggest, kind of building on the terminology John reviewed with us, this is probably assisted population expansion, maybe bordering on assisted range expansion for those three species. So not terribly radical, other than the fact that we're talking about a red pine, pine-dominated forest, and these hardwoods are something we're trying to promote in that system. Here's where it gets a little bit different and a little bit riskier, and we recognize that, but this is done within the context of a big-scale experiment. The transition treatment also includes Ponderosa Pine. And the reason for Ponderosa Pine is we were searching for, if the projections are true, and by the end of the century, habitat suitability for red pine, the iconic species in this forest type, are declining to the extent that some of the models suggest, we're asking ourselves, what's a functional, what's a social, what's an ecological replacement for red pine in this forest system? So we struggled with this for a bit, and various workshops and so on, and bringing a lot of experts. And we kind of focused on Ponderosa pine. So it's a large stature pine, like red pine. It's fire adapted, like red pine. Does well wet, kind of wet, moist winters, and then summer dry. That's the projection for northern Minnesota. It's also widely planted in northern Minnesota as a landscape and windbreak tree. It's very common, in fact. And the thought is potentially it's socially acceptable in terms of an alternative to red pine, and potentially an ecological alternative as well. So the twist is there's no natural populations of Ponderosa pine within 200 kilometers of northern Minnesota, the kind of central part of it. So in terms of that kind of terminology, we're probably bordering on translocation of an exotic species. We didn't go into this blindly. There's actually a very long-running provenance trial that the University of Minnesota has been running for Ponderosa pine, 70 or so provenance, and planted in different parts of the northern Minnesota. And what we did is look at that data and selected 4 seed sources that are the best performing in terms of survival and growth. And they all happen to come from here. Southwestern South Dakota, a couple Black Hills sources, a Nebraska source, and a southeastern Montana source. Lowest elevation from the seed sources that they evaluated, and the farthest east. So probably not surprising. So the idea here is, again, on this national forest to kind of venture into operationalizing assisted migration in a pretty big way. So this is a huge project. It is done in the context of research, but it's an operational timber harvest for this forest, or it was. So, it's like 1,000 hectares, almost 1 million. This is board feet in English units harvested, and a big planting effort. So the seedlings I'm talking about are approaching 300,000 seedlings that we planted just for this experiment. And we're monitoring a whole bunch of things. It's not just about assisted migration, but survival and growth of trees and disease and songbirds and so on. And there's a lot of follow-up activity with this, with competition control, browse protection. We've already scheduled the next thinning for the resistance experiment. And the point of this is, for this national forest, this is a bit more than just a research project. It's really an operational scale AM attempt on their part to put it in practice. But I think the interesting part of it, and the part we kind of made sure that we pursued in the context of the asked experiment, it's done within the context of evaluating multiple adaptation approaches. So we're not just blindly going out there, even though Minnesota Public Radio has accused me of saying we need to start planting Ponderosa Pine widely in Minnesota. That really wasn't the goal. It was to start evaluating these approaches operationally. So, don't know, I have 30 seconds. So you can just kind of see the summarization there, and we'll have time at the end for questions as well if I don't have any now. Sean says, Sean says one question. Yeah.
Have you had any social pushback to the idea of Ponderosa Pine beyond their radio station?
We had a lot of people scratching their heads on it as to why doing it, but it's not been as large of a pushback as I would have thought. Even the National Forest System in the U.S. each region has a geneticist, and that person wasn't even concerned about this. I think because of the framework that this Ask Thing project is kind of laid out in, is that we're evaluating these multiple approaches. It's not just transition with Ponderosa Pine, it's a range of activities. So it seems to be more socially acceptable than I thought it would. Yeah, so Sally's question was, the Nature Conservancy in Minnesota is working a bit with assisted migration in northeastern Minnesota. I'm on their Science Advisory Board, so I am aware of that project. And it's a little bit less, and it's ambitious, but less controversial in that they're working largely with, more in line with what you were talking about, the native species, but bringing in different genotypes of those species. So not really jumping, range with species themselves, but it's going on. Yep. Probably should move on, Sean, right? Okay, thank you.